Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. You're watching Free Speech TV, and with me is Kari Lydersen. She is a contributor to Working In These Times. That's the blog of the magazine In These Times. She's also an instructor and teacher of journalism based in Chicago. Kari, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Talk a bit about being a woman on the labor beat. There aren't enough women, I would say, covering this particular part of our world.
That's a good point. I love covering labor, and I think there's just great stories, and a lot of the stories, in Chicago especially, there's a lot of the sort of traditional, the Teamsters and the stories where the subjects are a lot of men, but, especially with immigrant workers and with a lot of the exciting things going on in the labor movement, they are really driven by women, so it would make sense to have more women covering the beat as well.
Talk about how the image of labor has changed, because you're right. I mean, I think the majority of workers at this point are women and people of color, at least those that are in unions. And yet the image that we have, particularly of the labor movement, tends to still be the good old white guy.
I think it definitely is, and I think that's a big obstacle because a lot of people, and I speak to college classes a lot about labor, so I hear, what college students from different demographic backgrounds, what their sort of image and stereotypes of labor are, and it definitely is the sort of old white guys and, the corruption and some of the old negative stereotypes about labor. So even though the actual labor movement has changed, I think the outdated images still really hold back sympathy for labor.
How has that played out, or has it played out, in one of the struggles you and I have both covered recently, which is the fight around collective bargaining rights for public workers in Wisconsin?
I guess that's a place where maybe at least in terms of gender and maybe to a lesser degree race, the stereotype's been challenged a little bit, or people have seen it more as something where, everyone's a worker, a wider range of people are workers. And I was personally surprised to see how broad the sympathy and solidarity was for public workers. And, it seems like that's mushrooming. And I actually really noticed that too with the Republic Windows and Doors occupation in Chicago. That was, a fairly diverse, both gender and race-wise, workforce, and people really from all walks of life did embrace them sort of as their own.
Remind people what happened there. Maybe start at the beginning. Republic Windows and Doors. When did you first hear there was an issue at that Chicago plant?
Yeah, well, that was in December 2008, right before Christmas, and this family-owned window factory was closing, and as it turned out, the owner was basically defrauding the workers and the creditors and pretty much everyone involved, as is laid out in criminal charges he's facing right now. But the workers essentially planned to occupy the factory to demand, ideally to try to keep it open, but at the very least to demand the severance pay and vacation pay that they were due. And the community in Chicago and then nationally and even internationally really turned out in huge support, and all the local and some national politicians and even President-elect Obama expressed support for the workers, and they did convince Bank of America to put up the money that they were due. So it was sort of a real success story.
Are there any of the people from that story who you remember that stood out to you?
Oh yeah, a lot of them, and the one thing that's exciting is some of the leaders are now working on this campaign to organize warehouse workers, which is one of the most exploited and difficult to organize sectors. So some of the specific leaders, including the local president, Armando Robles, are involved with building solidarity and just even awareness that this sector and these abuses in it exist.
What difference does independent media make to a struggle like that one, or the struggle in Wisconsin?
Well, it really just spreads, especially in real time as things are happening. It has much more ability, since a lot of times independent media reporters are more plugged into these issues. They're on the story before the mainstream media, and in situations where every hour might count in terms of getting solidarity out there, they're just faster, and they already understand the background. So the independent media stories in a lot of cases are more accurate and more nuanced. So that plays a huge role in these movements.
As you cover this beat, what is your assessment of what working people in this country these days are up against?
I guess we see what they're up against with Wisconsin in terms of it being pitted as, working people are somehow to blame for the budget crisis, even though that's a pretty ridiculous conclusion. A certain sector of the public, including working people themselves, seem to be buying that, or politicians have at least been able to put forth that narrative. And then there's also, all the complicated issues like immigration and ways that working people are pitted against each other, which is what I would say is maybe the biggest challenge that people face.
With respect to your challenges as a reporter, you teach journalism as well. What do you share? What do you tell your students about the world out there for them to have a career in, to make a living in?
Yeah, making a living is very hard. I always tell them that. I tell them only to do it if they really love it, but I'm happy to see that a lot of students do seem to love it, and that it's just about, the stories and people fighting for justice in the workplace or otherwise. A lot of times make the best stories, so I think it's really natural that, having a passion for kind of making the world a better place dovetails with journalism and hopefully keeps people motivated even if the money doesn't.
But talk a bit more about that. I mean, in terms of a future, what is the future for budding journalists? Their hearts are in it, their passion is in it. But if we want a diverse world covered, and you've already said you think we need diversity of reporters to do that, what's it going to take? What do we need to change?
Well, I think there's definitely a ton of opportunities out there in terms of freelancing and opportunities to write. So I think it is possible for young reporters and reporters of any age to make a living at it, but it is really hard, and because it's a freelance existence, it discriminates automatically against people with families or people with more financial obligations. And so it's, I guess, going to take well, for one thing, just a lot of people who are really willing to do it and at the expense of other parts of their life, which isn't the ideal situation. But, that's already happening, and it will take more of that just to sustain the profession. And then as much support as possible, whether from the public or foundations or whatever it might be, something needs to happen.
Finally, you were covering the labor beat throughout the last few years as a discussion has been developing around the American dream. Is it still a reality for people, a possibility for people? And I'd ask you, do you have a belief in the American dream, and is it still attainable? What is it to you?
Well, I think the old-fashioned American dream of, a lifelong stable job and a pension, that doesn't look very realistic for for many people at all, any time really in the foreseeable future. I think I'm just maybe slightly younger than when people did grow up expecting that dream, and personally that's not necessarily what I would want, but I think everyone would at the very least dream of, not having to worry about being homeless or impoverished in their old age or at any time in their life, and that's hard to, not many people even can feel that sense of security right now. So I think one positive note, I think people do have a sense that they should be able to do what they love, and I think a lot of young people I deal with see that as the American dream even more than financial stability. So if they can at least survive somehow doing that with some degree of workers' rights, or who knows, that may be it.
Kari Lydersen from In These Times. You can find her work there on their blog.
Thank you.
Thank you.